the best conversation without any direct prompts. But I do want to just ask one question from the audience, and I think it goes back to a point that Balaji pointed out on the pseudonymity or the cost of speech sort of theme here, which is just in that world, does that mean that you end up actually having more spam or just kind of BS because now people can just say whatever they want and have that tied to just not a lot of consequences?
What I think you really need.
How do you moderate that?
Yeah. So I think right now what we have, and we're going to look back on this as like, a disaster, but essentially what happened was what we have are things like Twitter, which are just public war zones, right? They're like a combination of a library and Liberia. Liberia, was in like the middle of a civil war for many years, right? And the thing is that you have folks who are there to learn, and you have folks who are there to fight, right? And fighting gets engagement, and fighting is kind of a low IQ thing you can do. How many times? I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever had this experience, but any post that you put up that has an equation, it's like garlic to trolls. It basically just repels them because they're like, I don't understand this, right? I kind of want, like, every time I type water to substitute with dihydrogen monoxide as a sort of a troll repellent or something like that, right? But rather than try to do that sort of verbally and erect these sort of impromptu defenses, that's kind of like wearing a mask when you go outside. You might have to do that when the state has failed, but ideally what you want is a collective that prevents the virus from even getting there in the first place. So I think the next generation of social networks will not be these giant assemblies of people who have nothing in common besides a desire to get as many likes as possible that day. But instead, they'll actually be cryptographically moderated networks with purpose, basically proto-nations. And I think that's a huge thing of the future. I mean, basically what we're about to see, we're starting to see this with BitCloud and, with actually what some stuff that Twitter is doing with Bitcoin. I think we're starting to transition from just mere social networks to social networks plus cryptocurrency equals network nationalism. That is to say, you don't really care if somebody joins Instagram, but if you're a holder of crypto Instagram, you do care. Suddenly you're recruiting for it in the same way that you were recruiting for a cryptocurrency. And so the point is that these network nations will have not just their own cryptocurrencies, and their own values, but their own standards for what is true and not true, and so on and so forth. And ideally, there's at least one that is run by rational scientists and engineers, and that is essentially the filtering, like if you centrifuge something, right, you get all of these different layers out. Like there is that supernatant, right, that this is the thing that floats to the top. There should be at least one of those subnetworks that is genuinely rational, that knows when to fight when attacked, but that is not like a first strike kind of, character, that is rational enough to entertain new things, but not so empty-headed that, all kinds of woo and crystal stuff is taken on board. And what I'm describing is, I think, where we stand. Of course, that may be self-serving, but I'd like to think that's where we stand, where you can tell the difference between, let's say, early cryptocurrency versus a get-rich-quick scheme. One has technical substance, one does not. Same with longevity. There's actually technical substance there. It's not simply charlatans peddling a fountain of youth, but there's actually data and science there, right? So I think the answer here is we actually need to have groups, social networks, sort of like what ETH research is in some ways, sort of like what, Zcash has their forum, Filecoin has its forum. We've built these kinds of things in smaller groups. What we haven't done is actually take the torch and say, look, we're going to actually enforce civil discourse here. We're going to have physical levels of civility. We're not going to have the free-for-all of Twitter. If you want that, Twitter's right there. Go and knock yourself out. This is actually something which is more like a house or more like a community where we're actually trying to seek truth. And I think that's likely to be the way that we do it. And we're going to need to use cryptocurrency to align the incentives to build a defense there, right? To build essentially an online Athens of a kind, right? That's how I think about it. I'm open to other thoughts.
So just like for Vitalik, maybe kind of similar line to that same question, which is just understanding, like, okay, if you have this as a premise, does that mean, well, not does that mean, like, to my understanding, this creates more of these sub-communities and fragments, kind of groups to self-associate with the similar types of groups. And like, there are definitely negative effects to that type of behavior. I feel like Twitter, even though you have celebrities and doctors at the same time, like they can still have a discourse, but do you kind of prevent fragmentation in these worlds? Or
yeah, but here's the thing, 1950 was like peak homogenization, right? You had you had one telephone company, AT&T, and
Right.
two superpowers, the US and USSR, and three television stations, ABC, CBS, NBC, right? And it was the 20th century was the age of these gigastates, right? The US and the USSR, but also the PRC and so on and so forth, right? And as you go forward and backward in time, forward to like 1991 and backward to 1890, you actually start decentralizing. That was like a super centralized moment. You go forward in time, you get cable TV and then the internet. Backwards in time, you start to have, the robber barons that got, crushed by FDR and Teddy Roosevelt, and you have the closing of the American frontier in 1890. And in many ways, our future is our past, where we're kind of having, the tech barons like the robber barons, or the cryptocurrency like the era of private banking. The coronavirus is like the Spanish flu. Socialists and nationalists fighting in the streets is like Weimar. The inflation is like Weimar, and so on and so forth, right? We're kind of replaying in sort of a kaleidoscopic way pieces of our past, because I believe the fundamental driver is that the strength of the centralized state is kind of weakening, at least in the West. And so, another way of thinking about this is absolutely the I Love Lucy days are on their way out, where everybody gathered in front of a TV and they all just kind of watch the same thing, right? We have all these channels, but that's actually a rediscovery of all of this intellectual diversity that existed before that homogenizing moment of the mid-20th century, right? So in a sense, we're actually going back to the future if you take the long enough view. Many different schools of thought, many different kinds of traditions were wiped out by these gigastates of the 20th century. Now we're sort of, having that flourish again. And yeah, some of them are bad, but some of them are really good. And so we're going to have deviation upward and deviation downward, because that's what the internet does. The internet increases variance in everything by removing the middleman, removing the moderator, removing the mediator, removing the medium, which are both good and bad things. It just increases variance in everything. You get more upside and more downside. So we just lean into that. We want to amplify the upside.
Yeah, and I think I'd definitely say a very similar thing, which is that I definitely don't think that it's true as a blanket statement that fragmentation is bad. Like, often fragmentation can be good, right? Like, I think there might have even been, like, I don't remember the exact details, but studies where, like, if you do the thing where you get a bunch of people to like vote on how many balls are in a jar, and like the results are more accurate. The results are more accurate if they if you ask people independently and they don't see each other's answers, right? Like, fragmentation just is intellectual diversity. It allows different groups of people to focus on specific things and make focused efforts to like figure out specific things, like even if the larger environment doesn't understand what they're doing at first, right? Like longevity research, the fact that that's just like a bubble that managed to happen despite almost everyone in the world not caring about it for so long. Caring about existential risks like AI risk, that was also the result of a rationalist and kind of effective altruist philosopher bubble. I think it's not so much fragmentation versus being worse than no fragmentation. It's that like there is fragmentation, and the question is, are the fragments going to have positive sum or negative sum interactions with each other? And like status quo social media definitely creates lots of ways for fragments to have very negative sum interactions with each other, right? And I like the problem is basically that, like, one way to think about this is that the selection function that's operating on these fragments is one that basically is this kind of internet warfare, and internet warfare does not at all obviously corresponds to quality of an idea. The like part of what I think people might be seeing is that internet warfare is an even worse selection function than like highly civilized long form debate, and that's where like you can get this kind of reduction in quality from like basically print media to Twittering. But like a selection function that's even better is just the ability to like actually build something, and to have a fragment that actually creates something of value, right? And like some fragments can, and lots of other fragments can't.